Hi Angels. This is Breaking the Silence by the Angel Demon on AO3. Summary. After a heated confrontation with his parents, Bakugou leaves home and finds himself on the streets. Aizawa and Yamada take him in, offering a place to stay while his situation is sorted out. Though Bakugou struggles to accept their help, he slowly begins to open up, especially with the support of his friends Kirishima, Midoriya, and Todoroki. Over time, Bakugou starts to heal, realizing he doesn't have to face his struggles alone, finding peace with his new foster family and friends. Bakugou Katsuki stood at the back of the classroom, arms crossed, gaze fixed ahead. The steady hum of Aizawa-sensei's voice filled the room as he explained the day's training objectives, but Bakugou's mind was elsewhere. He stared blankly at the whiteboard, hearing the words, without absorbing them. He couldn't focus. Not really. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss. Bakugou still dominated in combat drills, still aced written exams with the same ferocity he applied to everything. But if anyone looked closely, they might have noticed the subtle shifts, the slight tightness in his jaw, the way his fists clenched and unclenched beneath his desk, how he snapped at anyone who even dared breathe too loudly in his vicinity. Today was no different. The moment Aizawa dismissed the class, Bakugou was the first out the door, pushing past Kirishima, who had been about to say something. Bakugou couldn't deal with small talk, with fake concern. Not today. Oi, Bakugou. Wait up. Kirishima's voice trailed behind him, but Bakugou didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He barreled through the hallways, headed straight for the training grounds. He wasn't running from Kirishima, or anyone. He was running from the noise in his head, the suffocating weight of everything he refused to acknowledge. The training ground was a sanctuary. Out here, Bakugou could forget. He could throw himself into his quirk, the explosions burning the edge off the frustration that coiled like a snake in his chest. The heat, the power, everything else fell away when he focused on the burn in his muscles, the smell of sweat and smoke. Bakugou. He heard Kirishima again, but didn't bother turning. The redhead jogged up beside him, falling into step. You've been acting weird lately, man. What's going on? Shut up, Bakugou snapped, but the words lacked his usual bite. Kirishima frowned but didn't push further. You know you can talk to me, right? Bakugou's scowl deepened. Talk? What the hell was there to talk about? Nothing Kirishima or any of his friends could say would fix the mess outside of UA, the mess that was his life. Flashback. Mom, I told you, I have a project to finish. I can't come home this weekend. His mother's voice crackled on the other end of the phone, harsh and unforgiving. You think I give a damn about your project, Katsuki? You better get your ass home. You don't even care what your father and I do for you, do you? All this work, and for what? For you to act like some kind of. Bakugou had hung up before she finished, throwing the phone onto his bed. He could hear her words long after the call ended, the insults looping in his mind like a broken record. It was always like this with her, cold and cutting. And his father? He barely spoke, just a silent presence in the background. Never standing up for him, never defending him. Just, there. Bakugou clenched his fists as the memory faded, feeling the familiar surge of anger bubbling in his chest. He couldn't go home this weekend. He wouldn't. The training dummy exploded under the force of his blast, and for a moment, the satisfying destruction dulled the anger. He could lose himself in this, the control, the precision. His quirk responded to his emotions, and right now, he needed something to focus on. Anything to drown out the noise in his head. Alright, that's enough for today. Aizawa's voice cut through the haze, and Bakugou whipped around to see him standing at the edge of the training ground. His hair was loose, and his tired eyes were sharp as they followed Bakugou's every movement. I'm not done, Bakugou barked, setting his stance to go again. You are. Aizawa's tone was calm but firm. You've been pushing yourself too hard. Bakugou's scowl deepened, the anger swirling dangerously close to the surface. I'm fine. Aizawa raised an eyebrow, unmoved by Bakugou's outburst. You're not. For a long moment, the two stood in silence, the tension thick in the air. Bakugou's heart pounded in his chest, his breathing ragged, but he refused to back down. He couldn't afford to stop, not when he was on the edge of something he couldn't control. Finally, Aizawa sighed, his voice dropping a notch. You're going to burn yourself out, Bakugou. Take it easy. Go rest. Bakugou grit his teeth. Rest? How could he rest when the moment he stopped, the weight of everything else would come crashing back down on him? But he didn't argue further. Without another word, he stormed off the training ground, leaving Aizawa behind. Later, in the dorm, Bakugou sat alone in the common room, the rest of his classmates off doing their own things. He usually avoided these spaces when they were crowded, but tonight, the emptiness of the dorm felt like a blessing. It was better to be alone. Less noise. Less judgment. But that peace didn't last. Bakugou, can we talk? He didn't need to turn to know it was Yamada. The voice was too recognizable, too loud even when it was softened with concern. Bakugou groaned internally. Of course, Present Mike would show up when all he wanted was space. What do you want? Bakugou muttered, not looking up. Yamada slid into the seat opposite him, folding his hands on the table. His usual enthusiasm was muted, replaced with a serious expression that Bakugou didn't appreciate. You've been off lately, man. Aizawa's worried. I'm worried. I don't need your worry, Bakugou shot back, his eyes narrowing. I'm fine. Yamada tilted his head, his glasses catching the light. No offense, but you don't look fine. You've been pushing yourself harder than usual, and even for you, that's saying something. Bakugou's jaw clenched, a sharp retort on the tip of his tongue, but he bit it back. He didn't want to deal with this right now. Not with Yamada. Not with anyone. What the hell do you care? Yamada's expression softened further. Because we're your teachers, Bakugou. And we care about you. If something's going on, you don't have to deal with it alone. The word struck a chord Bakugou hadn't expected, and for a split second, something in his chest ached. But he shoved it down, locking it away where no one could see. He couldn't show weakness, not here, not ever. I'm fine, he said again, his voice harsher than he intended. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor as he stormed out of the room. Yamada watched him go, his shoulders slumping slightly. He didn't follow. Flashback. The door to the house slammed shut behind him, and Bakugou was immediately met with silence. His parents' house was large, spacious, but cold. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind that made you feel like you didn't belong there. His mother was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand, her eyes narrowed as she looked up at him. Late again. Bakugou said nothing, dropping his bag at the door. Don't bother making excuses, she continued, her voice like ice. You always have an excuse. He stood frozen in the doorway, the familiar anger bubbling up again. I had training. You always have training. Always something more important than your family. Don't you care about us at all? Bakugou's fists clenched. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Nothing he said mattered, anyway. No matter what he did, it was never enough. He turned and walked out without another word. The next morning, Bakugou was back in class, and from the outside, he looked the same as ever, ready for another day, ready to prove himself. But inside, the cracks were starting to show. The pressure, the weight of everything, was growing too heavy to ignore. He was breaking. And no one had noticed yet. But they would. Bakugou's footsteps echoed through the empty hallways of UA as he made his way to the dorms. It was late, too late, really, to still be at school. He hadn't bothered to check the time, hadn't even tried to go home after training. His house was just a few train stops away, but the idea of walking through the front door, facing his mother's sharp words and his father's silent indifference, made his stomach churn. So he didn't go. Instead, Bakugou slipped into the common area of the dorms, finding his usual corner. The couches here were worn but comfortable, and for the past week, they'd served as his bed more often than his own. His classmates hadn't noticed yet, or at least, they hadn't said anything. He always made sure to leave early enough to avoid suspicion, acting like he was heading home before anyone woke up. He didn't need their pity. Bakugou settled onto the couch, folding his arms behind his head and staring at the ceiling. He hated this. He hated feeling stuck, hated the helplessness that gnawed at his insides. Everything in his life felt like it was spiraling, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. His mind was racing, his body tense, but exhaustion pulled at him, dragging him into a restless sleep. Morning came too soon, and Bakugou woke with a start, blinking against the early sunlight streaming through the windows. He sat up, rubbing a hand over his face, and glanced around. No one was in the common room yet. Good. He had a few minutes before the others started waking up and would ask why he was here so early. Grabbing his bag, he headed for the showers, moving quickly to wash off the tension that clung to him like a second skin. The scalding water barely helped, but it was something, at least it distracted him from the mess waiting outside these walls. By the time he got to class, the usual energy was starting to fill the room. His classmates chatted in small groups, and Kirishima waved him over the moment he walked in. Bakugou. Hey, man, you coming to the arcade after class today? We've been planning it all week. Bakugou barely glanced in Kirishima's direction. No. Kirishima blinked, caught off guard by the blunt response. Are you sure? We were thinking it'd be fun to. I said no, Bakugou snapped, his voice a low growl that silenced any further attempts at conversation. Kirishima frowned, stepping closer. Come on, dude, what's up with you lately? You've been acting weird, and... Mind your own damn business, shitty hair, Bakugou spat, his temper flaring. I don't need you or anyone else worrying about me. The words were harsher than he intended, but Bakugou didn't care. He wasn't in the mood for Kirishima's concern. He didn't need to be babysat, didn't need anyone acting like they cared. Kirishima's face fell, but Bakugou turned away before he could see the hurt in his friend's eyes. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Bakugou could feel Kirishima's gaze on him, could sense the tension between them, but he pushed it all aside. He couldn't afford to think about that now, not when the weight of everything else was already threatening to crush him. Later, during the afternoon training session, Bakugou's frustration boiled over. His anger had been simmering all day, and it only took one mistake, one slip-up, for it to explode. They were in the middle of a mock battle exercise, paired off in teams, and Bakugou was up against Kaminari. Normally, it would have been an easy match for him, his explosions could overpower Kaminari's electricity, and he'd done it countless times before. But today, everything felt off. His movements were too sharp, too reckless, and his mind wasn't in it. Kaminari sent a bolt of electricity toward him, and Bakugou dodged, but not quickly enough. The edge of the attack grazed his side, sending a jolt of pain through him. It wasn't enough to hurt, not really, but it was enough to tip him over the edge. With a roar of frustration, Bakugou's quirk flared to life, an explosion erupting from his hands, with far more force than intended. The blast sent Kaminari flying backward, crashing into one of the training dummies. For a moment, everything went still. Bakugou stood frozen, his hands still smoking, heart pounding in his chest. Kaminari groaned from where he lay, dazed but not seriously injured. The others rushed over, concern and shock written across their faces. Bakugou. Midoriya called, his voice sharp with worry. What the hell was that? But Bakugou couldn't answer. His mind was racing, guilt mixing with the lingering anger. He hadn't meant to hit Kaminari that hard, he wasn't even sure why he'd lost control. It was like his body was acting on instinct, responding to the pressure he couldn't keep bottled up anymore. Aizawa appeared out of nowhere, his scarf tightening around Bakugou's arms, cutting off his quirk before he could do any more damage. That's enough, Aizawa said, his tone firm but calm. Bakugou's chest heaved as he struggled against the restraint, his body still buzzing with adrenaline. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and for a moment, he thought he might snap again, lash out at Aizawa for daring to stop him. But then the weight of what had just happened settled in, and his anger deflated. Aizawa's grip loosened, and Bakugou stumbled back, breathing heavily. He didn't meet anyone's eyes, couldn't face the questions and judgment waiting for him. Training's over for today, Aizawa announced, his gaze sweeping over the rest of the class. Everyone, get cleaned up. Bakugou, stay behind. Bakugou felt his stomach drop, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. When the others had cleared out, Bakugou stood in the middle of the training ground, staring down at the scorched earth where his explosion had landed. His hands were still shaking, his head pounding. You lost control, Aizawa said, stepping up beside him. His voice wasn't accusatory, but there was a weight to his words that Bakugou couldn't ignore. What's going on with you? Nothing, Bakugou muttered, his jaw tight. I'm fine. Aizawa didn't move, his gaze steady and unwavering. You're not. I've been watching you, and so has Yamada. You're pushing yourself too hard, and now you're starting to put others in danger. Bakugou clenched his fists, his teeth grinding together. I don't need your help. You almost hurt Kaminari today. And this isn't the first time you've let your anger get the better of you. Bakugou's anger flared again, hot and uncontrollable. I said I don't need your damn help. His voice echoed across the empty training ground, harsh and ragged. But Aizawa didn't flinch. He didn't react at all, standing calm and firm like a wall Bakugou couldn't break through. If you don't get this under control, it's going to cost you more than just a fight, Aizawa continued, his tone even. You've been slipping, Bakugou. I know you're struggling with something outside of school. We can help you, but you have to let us. Bakugou's chest tightened, his fists trembling at his sides. The words hit him harder than he expected, and for a brief moment, he felt the urge to spill everything, about his home, about how his parents barely spoke to him unless it was to tear him down, about how he couldn't face going back there anymore. But then the walls slammed back into place, and he shoved the vulnerability down, deep into the pit of his stomach where no one could reach it. I don't need anyone, he ground out, turning on his heel and walking away before Aizawa could say anything else. That night, Bakugou didn't go home. He wandered the city for hours, letting the noise and the lights distract him from the storm raging inside his chest. By the time he returned to the UA dorms, it was well past midnight, and the common room was empty, just like he preferred. He collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but unable to sleep. His mind wouldn't stop racing, wouldn't let him find any peace. Everything felt like it was slipping out of his control, no matter how hard he tried to hold it all together. And the worst part was, he didn't know how to fix it. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, Bakugou realized something he hadn't let himself admit before: he wasn't fine. Not even close. But admitting that felt like losing. And Bakugou Katsuki didn't lose. Bakugou Katsuki stood in the middle of his living room, fists clenched, glaring at his mother across the room. The house was silent except for the heavy breathing of the two people inside. His father wasn't there, he was never there when things came to this. Bakugou's chest heaved, his heart pounding in his ears as he tried to rein in the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. You think I care about your stupid little hero school? Mitsuki Bakugou's voice cut through the silence like a whip, her eyes blazing with fury. You think you're special, just because you've got a flashy quirk and go to UA? You're just a kid who doesn't know how to respect his own parents. Bakugou's fists tightened at his sides, the heat of his quirk sparking faintly at his palms. I'm not a kid, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. I'm the best in that damn school, and you don't get to talk down to me like that. Mitsuki slammed her glass on the table, standing from her chair, her face twisted in anger. Don't you dare talk back to me. You've been acting like a spoiled brat for months, and now you think you can just ignore your family? Disappear whenever you feel like it? You've got responsibilities here. Bakugou laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. Responsibilities? What the hell do you care? You've never given a damn about what I do unless it makes you look good. All you ever do is criticize me. It's never enough, is it? You watch your mouth, Katsuki, his mother snapped, stepping toward him. We've done everything for you, and this is how you repay us? By acting like some rebellious little punk? Everything for me? Bakugou's voice rose, shaking with barely contained rage. You don't do anything for me. You sit here and drink, and Dad pretends I don't even exist half the time. Don't act like you give a damn. Mitsuki's eyes flashed, and for a moment, the room was deadly silent. Then she moved, her hand raising as if to strike him, but Bakugou caught her wrist mid-swing, his grip ironclad. Don't, he said, his voice suddenly cold. I'm done. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mitsuki stared at him, her mouth half open, but no words came out. Bakugou released her wrist and stepped back, his breathing ragged. I'm done with this place. I'm done with you. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the front door, grabbing his bag on the way out. He didn't care where he went. He just had to get out. He slammed the door behind him, the sound reverberating through the quiet street as he stalked down the sidewalk, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. The night air was cool against his skin, but Bakugou barely noticed. His head was spinning, his thoughts a jumbled mess. His entire body was trembling, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the storm raging inside him. Where was he even going? He had no plan. No destination. He just walked. He wandered the streets aimlessly, the lights of the city blurring in his vision. His legs ached from walking for hours, but he refused to stop. He couldn't go back. He wouldn't go back. Eventually, Bakugou found himself in a park, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the grass. He collapsed onto a bench, his body sagging with exhaustion. His mind was a mess of thoughts he didn't want to face, emotions he didn't know how to handle. For once in his life, he had no plan. No clear goal. Just an overwhelming emptiness he didn't know how to fill. He ran a hand through his hair, tugging at the strands in frustration. What the hell was he supposed to do now? He couldn't go home, but he wasn't about to crawl back to the UA dorms and admit he'd been hiding this from everyone. He didn't need their pity. He didn't need their help. He was fine. Except he wasn't. Back at UA, Kirishima paced the common room, his brow furrowed with worry. He's not answering his phone, he muttered, glancing at Midoriya and Todoroki, who sat nearby. Bakugou's been off all week, and now he's not even showing up. Something's wrong. Midoriya chewed his lip, his eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. I've never seen him like this before. Do you think he's okay? Todoroki leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. Bakugou doesn't talk about his problems. If he's missing, there's a reason. Kirishima's hands balled into fists. We have to find him. The three boys exchanged a look, unspoken understanding passing between them. Bakugou could be difficult, but he was their friend, and they weren't about to leave him alone when he was clearly struggling with something. They split up, searching the areas Bakugou usually frequented, checking training rooms, and even wandering the city streets in the hope of catching a glimpse of him. Hours passed, and their worry only deepened as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the empty streets. Finally, it was Aizawa and Yamada who took over the search. Yamada had noticed Bakugou's recent behavior and voiced his concerns to Aizawa, who had been keeping a close eye on the boy ever since. "He's not at the dorms, and his classmates can't find him," Yamada said, adjusting his glasses as they walked through the quiet streets. "I have a bad feeling about this, Shoyuta." Aizawa's expression was grim as he scanned the area. "He's been slipping for a while. I should have stepped in sooner." They continued searching, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Eventually, they found him. Bakugou was sitting on a park bench, hunched over, his hands gripping his knees tightly. His entire body was tense, his head bowed as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. Yamada approached first, his voice soft. "Bakugou?" Bakugou's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with anger. "What the hell do you want?" His voice was sharp, but there was a tremor beneath the anger, a crack in his facade that hadn't been there before. "We've been looking for you," Yamada said gently, his eyes full of concern. "You didn't show up for class, and your friends were worried." Bakugou scoffed, turning his gaze away. "I don't need anyone to worry about me. I'm fine." Aizawa stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're not fine, Bakugou. And you don't have to pretend anymore." Bakugou clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "I don't need your help." Aizawa's eyes softened, and he sat down on the bench beside Bakugou, leaving a respectful distance between them. "You're not alone in this. Whatever's going on, you don't have to deal with it by yourself." For a long moment, Bakugou didn't respond. His body was trembling, his mind a mess of conflicting emotions. He wanted to tell them to leave him alone, to walk away and never look back, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight, and for the first time in a long time, Bakugou didn't know what to do. Aizawa's voice was quiet when he spoke again. "We care about you, Bakugou. You don't have to keep carrying this weight on your own." Bakugou's breath hitched, his fists tightening until his knuckles were white. He could feel the walls he'd built around himself starting to crumble, the emotions he'd buried for so long clawing their way to the surface. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to show weakness, but he was exhausted. Physically, emotionally, mentally. He couldn't keep pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. I don't." Bakugou's voice cracked, and he slammed his fists against his knees, anger flaring up again to mask the pain. "I don't need anyone." Aizawa didn't react to the outburst, his gaze steady. "Needing help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." For the first time, Bakugou looked at Aizawa, really looked at him, and saw the understanding in his eyes. There was no judgment, no pity, just quiet empathy. Bakugou's shoulders sagged, the last of his defenses crumbling away. He bowed his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do." Aizawa placed a hand on his shoulder, a reassuring presence in the darkness. "You don't have to figure it out alone. We're here for you." Yamada stepped closer, his voice soft. "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe. We'll figure this out together, okay?" Bakugou didn't respond, but he didn't resist when they gently guided him to his feet, leading him away from the park and back toward UA. For the first time in a long time, Bakugou let himself be vulnerable, let himself accept the help he'd been denying for so long. And even though the road ahead was still uncertain, he wasn't walking it alone anymore. Bakugou sat on the edge of the couch in Aizawa and Yamada's small apartment, staring at the floor. His bag was slung over his shoulder, but he hadn't unpacked it. He wasn't planning to. This wasn't his home. It wasn't even a place he wanted to be. He hadn't argued when they'd insisted, he stay with them while things were sorted out with his parents. There wasn't much point in arguing when he didn't have anywhere else to go. He was here now, sitting in this too quiet living room, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him like a vice. Bakugou didn't know how long this arrangement would last, and he didn't care. He just wanted to get through it, without letting his walls fall any further than they already had. Aizawa had left him alone for the most part since they brought him here the night before. The man wasn't one for coddling, and Bakugou appreciated that. Still, the silence in the apartment was heavy, and even though Aizawa and Yamada weren't hovering, he could feel their presence nearby. It was unsettling. "Hey," Yamada's voice broke through the stillness, gentle, but full of energy. He appeared in the doorway to the living room, wiping his hands on a towel. "We've got some extra food if you're hungry." "I made too much, again." He chuckled, but the sound was quieter than usual, more subdued. Bakugou didn't look up. "I'm not hungry." Yamada didn't push, but Bakugou could feel him lingering for a moment longer. When he didn't say anything else, Yamada sighed softly and left him alone. This was how it had been for the past 24 hours. The two of them gave him space, never pushing too hard, but there was always that underlying concern. Bakugou hated it. He hated the way they watched him without really watching him, waiting for him to crack or fall apart. He wasn't going to. He was fine. He'd been through worse. But the truth was, he felt like a burden. Staying here, with his teachers, living with them, even temporarily, felt wrong. He didn't belong here. He didn't belong anywhere right now. The first few days blurred together. Bakugou spent most of his time in the guest room, sitting on the bed and staring at the wall, lost in his own thoughts. Aizawa and Yamada left him alone for the most part, only checking in occasionally to see if he needed anything. Bakugou always said no. He couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, like he was intruding on their lives. Every time Yamada tried to make conversation or offer him food, Bakugou would respond with a curt, "I'm fine," and retreat further into himself. The isolation was easier than facing the truth, that he wasn't okay. That everything had finally caught up to him. Late one evening, Bakugou lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. The dim light of the street lamp outside cast shadows on the walls, and the quiet hum of the apartment was broken only by the faint sounds of Yamada's voice as he spoke quietly to Aizawa in the other room. Bakugou couldn't make out what they were saying, but he didn't care. He turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. His mind was a mess, spinning with thoughts he didn't want to deal with. What was he doing here? How had it come to this? He wasn't supposed to be the one who needed help. He was supposed to be strong, independent, the one who could handle anything. And yet here he was, lying in a bed that wasn't his, in a home that wasn't his, with no idea what to do next. It was a few days later when Kirishima showed up at the apartment. Bakugou was sitting at the kitchen table, picking at the food Yamada had left for him. He hadn't really been eating, but today, he felt too tired to fight off the offer. He hadn't slept well the night before, the restless thoughts keeping him awake until the early hours of the morning. It had been almost 2 weeks since Aizawa and Yamada had taken him in. 2 weeks of adjusting to a new kind of normal, of learning to accept the help he had been denying for so long. It wasn't easy, none of this was. But for the first time, Bakugou allowed himself to try. He wasn't ready to unpack everything all at once. He wasn't ready to confront every painful memory or admit just how much the weight of his home life had worn him down. But he was starting to realize that he didn't have to do it all at once. Healing wasn't a race, and for once, Bakugou wasn't in a rush. The sliding door behind him opened, and Bakugou glanced over his shoulder to see Aizawa stepping out onto the balcony. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the railing next to Bakugou, staring out at the city below. "You've been quieter lately," Aizawa said after a while, his voice low. "That's not like you." Bakugou scoffed, his lips twitching in the ghost of a smirk. "I thought you'd appreciate the peace and quiet." Aizawa's lips quirked slightly, but his gaze remained serious. "I do. But I also know that when you go quiet, it usually means something's bothering you." Bakugou was silent for a moment, the weight of Aizawa's words hanging in the air between them. A part of him still wanted to deny it, to say that he was fine and brush off the concern. But after everything, he knew Aizawa wasn't going to fall for that. And maybe, just maybe, Bakugou was done pretending. "I don't know what to do," Bakugou admitted, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. "I've been so pissed for so long, at my parents, at everything, and now I'm just tired." Aizawa nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's understandable. You've been carrying a lot on your own. It's exhausting." Bakugou's grip tightened on the railing, his knuckles white. "I didn't think I needed help. I didn't think I deserved it." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of everything Bakugou had kept buried for so long. He had always been strong, always fought to be the best, but somewhere along the way, he had started to believe that needing help made him weak. That admitting he was struggling was the same as admitting failure. But now, sitting here with Aizawa, Bakugou was beginning to see things differently. "You deserve the same care and support as anyone else," Aizawa said quietly, his voice steady. "What you've been through doesn't make you any less worthy of that. It just makes you human." Bakugou swallowed hard, the tightness in his chest easing slightly at Aizawa's words. He wasn't used to this kind of reassurance, this quiet acceptance. But Aizawa and Yamada had been nothing but patient with him, never pushing too hard, never asking for more than he could give. It was strange. But not unwelcome. Aizawa straightened, pushing off the railing. "Come inside when you're ready. Yamada's making dinner, and I'm not going to let you skip another meal." Bakugou rolled his eyes, but there was no real heat behind it. Yeah. As Aizawa walked back inside, Bakugou remained on the balcony for a little while longer, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but the weight on his shoulders didn't feel as heavy anymore. It was still there, but it was manageable. And for the first time in a long time, Bakugou didn't feel like he had to carry it alone. The next morning, Bakugou returned to UA. It wasn't as strange as he'd expected, walking back into the school after nearly 2 weeks away. The routine was familiar, and Bakugou slipped back into it easily enough. But there was a shift in the way his classmates looked at him, the way they interacted with him. It wasn't pity, they knew better than to pity him, but there was a quiet understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement that things were different now. Kirishima was the first to greet him, a wide grin splitting his face as soon as he saw Bakugou enter the classroom. "Bakugou. You're back." There was a knock at the door, and Bakugou tensed instinctively, his eyes flicking to the entrance. He wasn't expecting anyone. Aizawa and Yamada were out for the afternoon, leaving him alone in the apartment. He wasn't used to being here by himself, but at least it was quiet. The knock came again, louder this time, and Bakugou reluctantly got up to answer it. He swung the door open, ready to tell whoever it was to leave him alone. "Kirishima?" Bakugou blinked, surprise flickering across his face. Kirishima stood there, a sheepish smile on his face. Hey. Aizawa-sensei told me you were staying here for a bit, so I thought I'd come by and check on you." Bakugou scowled, stepping back to let him in. "I don't need checking on." Kirishima raised his hands defensively. I know. But we're friends, right? Just thought I'd hang out for a bit, see how you're doing." Bakugou didn't respond, closing the door behind him and heading back to the kitchen. Kirishima followed, glancing around the apartment. This place is nice. It's weird seeing Aizawa-sensei living in a normal apartment, though, Kirishima said with a laugh, trying to break the awkwardness. Bakugou sat back down at the table, pushing his plate aside. What do you want, Kirishima? Kirishima frowned, leaning against the counter. I just wanted to see you, man. We were all worried when you didn't show up for class. You didn't say anything to anyone. It's not like you. Bakugou tensed, his eyes narrowing. I'm fine. Kirishima sighed. You don't have to be, you know. It's okay to not be fine. The words grated on Bakugou's nerves, and he stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I don't need your sympathy. It's not sympathy, Kirishima said quickly, his voice soft but firm. It's just. I'm your friend, Bakugou. We all are. We care about you. Bakugou's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. He didn't want this. He didn't want Kirishima's concern, his care. It made him feel weak, like he was some fragile thing that needed to be protected. I don't need anyone, Bakugou muttered, turning away from him. Kirishima stepped closer, his expression determined. That's not true. You've been dealing with this alone for too long, and it's okay to lean on people sometimes. We're all here for you, Bakugou. Me, Midoriya, Todoroki, everyone. Bakugou's chest tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. The weight of everything he'd been carrying for so long suddenly felt unbearable, crushing him from all sides. He wanted to yell, to push Kirishima away, but the words wouldn't come. Kirishima's hand landed gently on his shoulder, and Bakugou flinched at the contact. But Kirishima didn't pull back. You're not alone, man, Kirishima said quietly. You've got people who care about you. You don't have to go through this by yourself. Bakugou's throat tightened, and he could feel the walls he'd built around himself starting to crack again. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought against the emotions welling up inside him. But Kirishima's words hit harder than he expected. Because deep down, Bakugou knew they were true. He wasn't alone. Slowly, painfully, Bakugou's guard began to drop. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to show weakness, but Kirishima's quiet persistence broke through the walls he'd built around himself. For the first time in a long time, Bakugou let himself feel the weight of everything he'd been carrying. The fear, the anger, the pain, it all came crashing down, and he didn't try to stop it. Kirishima stayed by his side, quiet and steady, offering the kind of support Bakugou didn't know he needed. And in that moment, Bakugou realized something he hadn't let himself believe before. He didn't have to do this alone. By the time Midoriya showed up later that evening, Bakugou had calmed down, though the weight of his emotions still lingered. Midoriya was his usual awkward self, unsure how to approach Bakugou in this vulnerable state, but he didn't push. Instead, they sat together in the living room, the quiet comfortable for once. Bakugou wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. But he didn't feel as isolated as he had before. For the first time since everything fell apart, Bakugou felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be okay again. Bakugou Katsuki sat on the balcony of Aizawa and Yamada's apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The quiet hum of the night filled the space around him, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't overwhelmed by it. The chaos in his head had quieted, though it still lingered like a low buzz, just beneath the surface. He could think, breathe, without feeling like he was going to explode. Bakugou grunted, but there was no real annoyance in his tone. Don't make a big deal out of it. Kirishima's grin only widened, and he clapped Bakugou on the back, careful not to overstep the boundaries that had been so fragile before. It's good to see you, man. We missed you. Midoriya was next, his usual nervous energy softened with genuine concern. Are you feeling better? He asked hesitantly, as if afraid of overstepping. Bakugou rolled his eyes, but there was no edge to it. I'm fine, Deku. Midoriya blinked, surprised at the lack of bite in Bakugou's tone, but he nodded quickly. I'm glad. If you need anything, we're all here, okay? Bakugou didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something close to gratitude, in his eyes. He wasn't used to this, but he was starting to realize that maybe he didn't mind it as much as he thought he would. As the day went on, Bakugou found himself surrounded by his friends more than usual. Kirishima, Todoroki, and Midoriya made sure to include him in their conversations, their training sessions. They didn't push him to talk about anything he wasn't ready to share, but their presence was a quiet reminder that he wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long time, Bakugou didn't push them away. Later that evening, back at Aizawa and Yamada's apartment, Bakugou sat at the kitchen table, poking at his dinner. Yamada was chattering away about some new music he was working on, his energy infectious even in the small space of the apartment. You should come by the studio sometime, Bakugou, Yamada said with a grin. I bet you'd have fun messing around with some of the equipment. We could make something loud and explosive, just your style. Bakugou snorted, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Yeah, maybe. Yamada's grin widened, but he didn't push further, turning the conversation back to his latest playlist. Aizawa sat across from Bakugou, his expression calm as he sipped his tea. There was no pressure, no expectations, just quiet support. Bakugou still wasn't sure how to feel about all of this. He wasn't used to being cared for like this, wasn't used to the idea of relying on others. But Yamada and Aizawa had given him space to breathe, to figure things out at his own pace. And slowly, Bakugou was beginning to trust that they weren't going to disappear. As the evening wore on, Bakugou found himself relaxing, the tension in his shoulders easing bit by bit. The apartment was small, but it was warm, comfortable in a way that Bakugou hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't home, not yet, but it was a place where he could heal. And that was enough. The weeks passed, and Bakugou began to settle into a new routine. He attended class, trained with his friends, and returned to Aizawa and Yamada's apartment at the end of the day. His relationship with his parents was still a mess, but he was beginning to accept that it wasn't something he had to face alone. One evening, after a particularly long day of training, Bakugou sat on the couch in the living room, his body sore, but his mind at ease. Aizawa sat in the armchair nearby, flipping through a stack of papers for work, while Yamada hummed quietly to himself as he organized his music files. It was peaceful. And for once, Bakugou didn't feel the need to fill the silence with noise or anger. He could just be. Hey, Bakugou said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Aizawa looked up, his gaze steady. Yeah? Bakugou hesitated for a moment, the words heavy on his tongue. But then he let out a breath, the tension easing from his shoulders. Thanks. For everything. Aizawa's lips quirked in a small smile, and Yamada beamed from where he stood by the computer. Anytime, kid. We're here for you. Bakugou nodded, his gaze softening. He still had a long way to go, still had wounds that hadn't fully healed. But he was starting to see that he didn't have to face it all on his own. And for the first time in a long time, Bakugou felt at peace. This is the end of Breaking the Silence by the Angel Demon on AO3. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any suggestion, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to know when the next one is out. Have a good day.